Saville by David Story, Part 1, Chapter 1. Towards the end of the third decade of the present century, a coal harrier's cart, pulled by a large dead grey horse, came into the narrow streets of the village of Saxton, a small mining community in the low hill-land of South Yorkshire. By the side of the harrier sat a dark-haired woman with phlegmatic features and dark brown eyes. She wore a long reddish coat which covered the whole of her except for her ankle, and a small, smooth-crowned hat which fitted her head rather like a shawl, and beneath which her hair showed in a single upturned curl. In her arms, wrapped in a grey blanket, sat a child, scarcely more than a year old, with fair hair and light blue eyes, whom, as the cart pulled into a street several hundred yards from the village centre, where the houses gave way to farm fields, gazed about it in a blinded fashion, its attention suddenly distracted from the swaying of the horse in front. On the back of the cart were piled numerous items of household furniture. Numerous that it is in the context of the cart, for it was plainly not designed to carry such a multifarious cargo. There were a square wooden table with 4 wooden chairs, 2 upholstered chairs in a dilapidated condition, a double bed with wooden headboards and a metal sprung base, various pots and pans and boxes, a cupboard, a chest of drawers, and a tall, brown painted wardrobe, the door of which was lined with a narrow mirror. Riding uncomfortably on top of this load was a small, fair-haired man with light blue eyes. He wore a loose, unbuttoned jacket, a collarless shirt, and, unlike the woman, was gazing around him with evident pleasure. As the cart came to a turning of small terrace houses leading directly towards the fields, he called out to the driver, who, clicking his tongue, turned the horse, and to the fair-haired man's instructions, pulled up finally outside a small stone-built house, the center one of a terrace of 5. A door and a window occupied the ground floor of the building, and 2 single windows. The first floor, the roof itself, topped by large, uneven stone slab states. The fair-haired man sprang down. He opened the tiny gate that led across a garden scarcely 6 feet broad, and, taking a key from his jacket pocket, unlocked the dull brown door and disappeared inside. A few moments later he came out again. He signaled to the cart, and after a moment's hesitation the child was lifted down. No sooner was it on its feet, however, than it set off with unsteady steps, not towards the open gate, but away from it, back along the street the way they'd come. "Nay, Andrew," the man called, and after helping down the woman, he turned and went after the baby, finally catching him up in his hands and laughing. "And where's thy off to then?" he said, delighted with the child's robustness. "Oh, back home then, are you?" turning the baby's head towards the house. "This is their home from now on," he added. "This is where Burns to live," and called to the woman who stood apprehensively now at the open gate. "Here then, Ellen, you can take him in." The furniture was lifted down, and the harrier and the fair-haired man carried it inside. The bed and pieces was set down in the tiny room at the front upstairs. A cot, little more than a mattress in a wooden box, was set beside it. With that and the wardrobe, there was scarcely any space to move at all. The chest of drawers was squeezed into one of the two rooms overlooking the rear of the house. One room was scarcely the width of a cupboard, the other was square-shaped. Its narrow window, looking down on to the communal backs, and beyond those the strips of garden exclusive to each house, which ran down to the fenced field and were enclosed by the houses the other side. The remainder of the furniture was set in the kitchen and the front room downstairs. "Well, fancy we mun celebrate," the hair-haired man said when the job was done. He hunted through the various boxes and produced finally 3 cups from a shopping bag. He took out a bottle. He looked round for somewhere to remove the top and finally edged it off against the square-shaped sink, which stood beneath a single tap in the corner of the kitchen. A high metal-shanted cooking range and a pair of inset carpets occupied the remainder of the wall. "None for me," the mother said, still holding the baby to her and looking round at the room. "I can't stomach beer." "Just what you want after a job like this." The fair-haired man drank his undismayed. "Well, here's to it, Mr. Saville," the harrier said. "Good luck and happiness in your new home." He raised his cup to the dark-haired woman, who until now had removed neither her coat nor her hat, and added, "May all your troubles be little ones." The woman glanced away. The fair-haired man had laughed. Here's to it," he said, quickly filling his cup again and offering the remainder to the driver. Finally, when the cart had gone, the front door was closed and Saville and his wife began to arrange the furniture in the tiny room. A fire was lit. They made some tea and sat looking at the bare interior of the kitchen. The stains and the smells of the previous tenant were evident all around. The woodwork of the back door, which opened directly to the yard, was scratched through to the other side. There were cavities in the floorboards beneath which were visible odd pieces of paper and items of refuse, which finally disbelieving, Saville got down on his knees to examine. Would you believe it? They've showed their tea leaves down here. The baby had wandered off upstairs. They had its steps on the floor above. You'll have to watch it, the mother said. It's not used to stairs. Previously, they'd lived in a room in a flat. It was the first home they had had entirely to themselves. I shall have to make a gate, the father said, yet going to the stairs and looking up them proudly. Well, this is a grand place. We'll soon have it in shape, he added, seeing through the kitchen door his wife despairing glance, and with something of a laugh, going quickly to her and endeavoring to hold her. No, she said, holding to the chair in which she was sitting. Her gaze turned disconsolately towards the fire. No, hot water, but what we hate, and the lavatory across the yard. It would have been worse. We could have been sharing it, the father said. Yes, she said with no belief. I suppose so, and added, rising to her feet, we'd better start. Nay, we can leave it for one day at least, her husband said. I could not leave it. I could not bear to sleep here, let alone cook and eat with all this dirt around. So, on that first day, the Savilles cleaned the house. They worked into the night. The gas flare from their lamps spread out into the yard long after the houses on either side were dark. The baby slept in its cot upstairs, undisturbed by the scrubbing and brushing. Towards dawn, the man slept for 2 hours. Then finally, as she light broke, he got up to he got up for work. I shall see you this afternoon, he said, standing at the door. I'll come back on the bike. I'll bring the last things over. He gazed in a moment at the room in which the fire still burned, then turning, set off across the yard. His wife watched him. On parting at the door, she'd kissed his cheek, and now, in the faint light spreading directly over the field before them and over the houses opposite, the isolation of her new home was suddenly apparent. She called up to the man, and he, turning finally at the end of the deserted yard to glance back, waved cheerily, as if this were for him the beginning of but one of many similar departures, and disappeared, still waving towards the road outside. The woman stood alone for a while, with the door closed, the fire still glowing. She gazed round her at the room. There was nothing there to reassure her, simply the table, the foot chairs, a cupboard, and the pots they'd mounted in the sink for washing. She sank down finally by the hearth and cried. The Savilles had been married 18 months when they came to Saxton. Before that, they had shared a room in a flat with another couple. Then finally had come the chance of a farm labourer's cottage in a neighbouring village. An old man had lived there, a widower, and it was the smell of his dog and his cat they were most aware of in the days following their arrival, and the odor of the food he'd pushed down beneath the floor. Not having had time to prepare the house, they spent the first few days scrubbing the floors, washing down the walls and woodwork, and filling the holes which the dog, with its scratching, had dug in the various doors and the plaster. They repaired the ceilings and replaced the crumbled boards in the floor. Finally, they distempered the walls, painted the outside woodwork, and in the evening, when Saville had slept from his morning shift at a colliery some 6 miles distance, he dug the garden, turning over the thickly matted weeds between the narrow barrier of fences. Late in the evening, he would take the child out and sit in the yard. He had built a wooden bench from disproportionate bits of timber, and here the child, on his knee, he would smoke his pipe, the baby, snatching at the clouds of smoke, Saville laughing. Soon there was a routine in the mother's care of the house. On Mondays, she did the washing. On Tuesdays, completed the drying and starting the iron. On Wednesdays, she did her midweek shopping, finished the ironing, and if she had time, baked bread, large tea cake shaped loaves, which fitted one to each shelf in the tiny oven, and smaller oblong shaped loaves, the top of which she raised in a large porcelain bowl in front of the fire. The boy, sitting in his chairs or on the floor, would watch her, eager at times to use the tub himself, watching her drawing it out and shaping it in the tins or on the black greased oven plates occasionally. If a fragment were over, rolling a piece himself and laying it on greaseproof paper. First in the heath, where the flames shone and flickered on its surface, then sliding it beside the tins inside the oven and waiting impatiently while his mother adjusted the tiny chromium ventilator and stoked the fire. Then finally looking at the clock on the tall mantel shelf, she stood to the door, a piece of hash in her hand, and if the bread were ready, lifted his out first. There, what do you think of that? She'd ask him absent-mindedly, her attention solely on the loaves and the tea cakes she'd baked herself. Yet there was a lightness in her son which believed his age, even a dexterity with his tiny hands, so that at times, although she helped him, she would be astonished at the way he took the bread and was able to connect the various stages, the mixing, the leavening, the shaping out, the final raising, and then the sliding of the plates and tins inside the oven. He must be a baker, Saville would say, coming home to see the tiny, irregular-shaped loaf the boy had baked himself, breaking a piece of at Andrew's insistence, putting on jam, and then watched raptly by his son, chewing it carefully and with evident pleasure. Nay, I mun come to this house again. They know how to treat a hungry man. On Thursdays, she cleaned the house upstairs, first to the front bedroom, the only room apart from the kitchen to have linoleum on the floor, which she washed and polished, then the two rear rooms, and finally the stairs. On Fridays, she swept and cleaned the kitchen, washing the floor and swept out and scrambled and scrubbed the tiny room at the front. Here the two easy chairs stood before an empty black enameled fireplace. This she polished as she did the black enamel on the stove in the kitchen. On Friday evening, the house smelled of polish, and the gaslight glowed, flaring against all the shiny surfaces. Saville, taking the baby, would bathe him in front of the fire, laying out sheets of paper and standing the metal rug in front of the hearth. Andrew would flap his arms and shout. The water would hiss against the coal. The mother would call at the damage done to the recently polished door. Saville himself would laugh sometimes, singing, leaning back on the heels as he knelt to the tub. The child finally gazing up at him with a look of wonder, his pale eyes bright, transfixed as his father, his face flushed, his teeth gleaming in the light from the fire, sang long and lustily for his amusement. By God, just see his little legs, Alan, he'd say as he stood the child in the bow, feeling the mound of muscle and fat, his own hand, and knotted and stained beneath the skin with tiny filaments of coal, incongruous against the smoothness and pinkness of Andrew's flesh. He'd lift him, still wet, above him in the air, the child's arms and legs flung out, dangling below him, calling, shrinking as he shook him by the fire, the flames sizzling once again, and the mother shouted, "Wash him, for goodness sake, without all that mess." Ellen frequently went back to visit her parents. They lived in a village 4 miles away. Their house, one of a pair, baking onto a paddock in which they kept geese and hens, and in sheds at the farthest end a number of pigs. She would take the boy with her, preparing him thoroughly for the journey in his best clothes, his face bright and gleaming, his hair brushed neatly and parted at the side. He would sit beside her in the bus, gazing out at the fields with the same look of perplexity which characterized his features whenever his mother chastised his father. His expressions vaguely disgusted, yet as if in a curious way their quarrel had scarcely anything to do with him at all. Mrs. Saville's mother was a small woman. She had had 7 children in all, 2 of whom had died, and had long since relinquished her domestic responsibilities to this surviving offspring, one of whom visited her almost every day. So it was whenever Ellen brought Andrew, and she obliged at some point of her visit to pull on an apron, roll up her sleeves, and to wash a floor or clean windows, wash the clothes, or prepare a meal. Her father, a tall, silent man who had been out of work for much of his later life and who scratched a living from the wheat strewn at the back of the house, would leave the women of the house to their own devices, for despite her good intentions, quarrels were frequently the outcome of Ellen's visits home. The keynote of her mother's resentment was her marriage to Saville, Ellen herself being the youngest of her mother's children and destined traditionally for several years at least to combine the services of a daughter and a domestic servant, an expectation which had been terminated by her marriage and further compounded by the birth of Andrew. The boy would sit between the ward women, immaculate in his child's youth, with his gleaming hair and bright, robust face, open, frank, and blue-eyed, vaguely aware of the animosity that passed between the adult figures and relating it conceivably to the animosity of a not dissimilar nature, a rancor and a bitterness that passed between his mother and father at home, and which usually had preceded, if not occasioned, this visit to his round-faced, red-cheeked, dark-eyed grandmother. His playing in the dust of the yard at the back of the house was readily supervisited by his mother. Occasionally, if he were allowed into the paddock at the back of the house, it was with instructions never to let go on his grandfather's hand, an injunction which The tall elderly man with large soft brown eyes and an almost inaudible voice, so self-effacing was his manner, it had to as conscientiously and as unremittingly as Andrews did himself. Saville, then what dost think to Jackie? He would say, holding him to the pig's pen, and if he couldn't see through the wooden lathens, lifting him to the top of the wall to peer over the mud at the mess that would fascinate them both, and they would still be gazing at the pink and witch's body splashing through it when Ellen's voice would call from the house, "Dad, bring him away from there." "Nay, Mac never did no man any harm," the old man would say when they got back to the house. "No," Ellen would say with the same vehemence as she did at home. "You don't have to wash and clean him." "Nay, I washed and cleaned 7 of them, and thy been one of them." "Who have you washed and cleaned?" the little old grandmother would say, and the father would turn away, silent, leaving these squabbles, as he always did, to the peculiar moralizing passion of the women. Yet Andrew enjoyed this visit to his grandparents' house. For one thing, he enjoyed being out of his home. Even going into the village with his mother he appreciated, as well as those longer journeys with his father that took him to the park on the slope that overlooked the village, or even farther afield than that were. Some 2 miles away, the river came round in a vast dark curve from the distant towns. On the journey back from his grandparents' house, his mother would frequently set him on her knee so that his head was raised to the bus window, and he gazed out at the fields from between her arms, a gesture she seldom made on the journey to the house when her thoughts seemingly were on the chastisement that they had. "Well, then, there's a horse," she would say to him on the journey back, pointing out objects that caught her attention as if she relieved of going home, and the peculiar victory she had won for survival in her family atmosphere was sufficient of a victory to satisfy Ellen, were scarcely more than she could bear. These moments of companionability were the deepest that Andrew and his mother shared, as if he himself were both a trophy and burden, and the successful recipient and the suffering host.